What if the strange feeling that you no longer recognize yourself isn't a personal failure? What if it isn't a midlife crisis, or burnout, or simply growing older? What if the question itself points somewhere else? Most people assume identity is something that, once formed, quietly remains. It changes, of course. It matures. It accumulates experience. But beneath those changes, there is an expectation that somewhere inside there is still a stable person who can say, "This is who I am." Yet more and more people quietly describe something different. They don't say they became worse. They don't say they became better. They say something much stranger. "I don't feel like myself anymore." Last week, we explored what that experience feels like, but today, the question is different. What kind of environment makes that experience increasingly common? Because perhaps identity was never built only from memory. Perhaps it was built from something even more fundamental: continuity. The feeling that today's version of you naturally grows from yesterday's, that your experiences accumulate instead of constantly resetting, that the person making today's decisions still feels connected to the person who made yesterday's. But what happens when the world around you changes faster than that continuity can form? What happens when every few years the rules change, the tools change, the expectations change, the economy changes, the technology changes, the way people communicate changes, and the version of yourself that was beginning to feel stable is asked to adapt all over again? Perhaps the modern system doesn't need to erase your identity. Perhaps it only needs to keep rewriting the conditions in which identity is built. And if those conditions never remain stable for long enough, maybe becoming someone unfamiliar is no longer surprising. Maybe it becomes the expected outcome. There is something almost invisible about this kind of change. We usually notice movement. We notice events. We notice decisions. We rarely notice conditions. A plant doesn't question itself because it grew differently after the soil changed. It simply responds to the environment surrounding it. Perhaps people are not as different as we like to believe. Before asking who we have become, it may be worth asking a quieter question. What kind of world have we been continuously becoming inside? Before we continue, it's worth understanding where this conversation fits. You're watching Darkside Protocol. Here, we begin one layer deeper. We investigate the systems and conditions that quietly make human experiences increasingly inevitable. This is one layer of Protocol Multiverse, a larger investigation explored from 3 different perspectives. Punchline Protocol begins with the human experience itself. Darkside Protocol investigates the systems behind that experience. Debrief Protocol steps back to connect both perspectives into one wider picture. Every film explores the same reality, from a different layer. If you'd like to explore the investigation from every perspective, you'll find all 3 paths waiting in the description. Now, let's continue. When people think about identity, they usually think about personality, values, memories, character, preferences. But perhaps identity begins much earlier than any of those things. Before you can become a particular kind of person, something else has to exist first. Continuity, not permanence, not perfection. Simply enough uninterrupted time for today's version of you to grow naturally into tomorrow's. Identity is less like a decision and more like a landscape. It is shaped by countless ordinary days that quietly resemble one another. The habits you repeat, the conversations you keep having, the places that become familiar, the people who continue recognizing the same version of you. Gradually, without noticing, those repetitions begin forming something remarkably stable, not because you chose it, because your mind starts expecting tomorrow to grow from today. This is how continuity becomes identity, not through dramatic moments, but through accumulated ordinary ones. We often imagine that major life events define who we are. In reality, extraordinary moments usually reveal a person that ordinary continuity has already been building for years. Identity is not assembled during crises, it is cultivated between them. This is why stability has always mattered more than certainty. A person does not need to know exactly where life is going, but they do need enough continuity to discover who they are while moving through it. The question then is no longer whether people change. Of course they do. The more important question is whether the conditions around them allow those changes to settle into something that still feels like one continuous life. Imagine watching a tree for a single day. Nothing seems to happen. Watch it for 20 years and everything has changed. Yet throughout that entire time, it remained recognizably the same tree. Not because it never changed, but because every new layer quietly grew from the one before it. Human identity may be less different than we imagine. We become ourselves not because we resist change, but because change usually has somewhere stable to arrive. Perhaps continuity is the invisible soil from which identity grows, and perhaps we only notice its importance when that soil slowly begins disappearing beneath our feet. For most of human history, change certainly existed. Empires rose and disappeared. New inventions appeared. Wars redrew borders. Families moved. Lives were interrupted. But for most people, the ordinary conditions of daily life remained surprisingly continuous. You were born into a community that changed slowly enough for your identity to mature alongside it. The tools you learned as a young adult were often the same tools you used decades later. The skills you developed remained valuable. The social expectations surrounding your life evolved gradually enough that you rarely had to reinvent yourself just to remain functional. Change arrived as an event. It did not become the environment itself. Something fundamentally different has emerged. Today, change is no longer something that occasionally interrupts stability. It has become the default condition of stability itself. Before one technology becomes familiar, another replaces it. Before one professional identity settles, industries reorganize. Before one social norm feels established, another begins taking its place. Even language evolves at a pace that previous generations would have considered extraordinary. None of these changes are inherently harmful. Many improve life. Many create opportunities. The system is not malfunctioning. It is behaving exactly as a rapidly optimizing system tends to behave. The question is not whether change is good or bad. The question is, what happens to human continuity when the environment asks for adaptation before yesterday's adaptation has fully become part of who you are? Perhaps this is why so many people quietly struggle to recognize themselves. Not because they lack resilience, not because they resist change, but because continuity quietly requires something that permanent acceleration rarely provides. Time to remain the same person long enough for that person to fully exist. Imagine trying to write a sentence while someone gently rotates the page beneath your hand. You are still writing. Your intention has not changed. Your ability has not disappeared. Yet every adjustment forces another adjustment before the previous one has settled. Eventually, the movement of the page becomes more important than the words you were trying to write. Perhaps identity works in a similar way. It is not only shaped by what we choose, it is also shaped by whether the world remains still long enough for those choices to become part of us. Adaptation has always been one of humanity's greatest strengths. We adapt to new places, new jobs, new relationships, new technologies, new responsibilities. Without adaptation, civilization itself would have been impossible. But adaptation was never meant to become a permanent state. It was meant to carry us from one stable reality into another. Traditionally, adaptation followed a simple rhythm. Something changed. You adjusted. Eventually, the new situation became familiar. What was once unfamiliar slowly became ordinary. Your attention relaxed. Your habits stabilized. Your identity quietly expanded to include the new reality. Then, life continued. That rhythm depended on one important condition. The environment eventually stopped demanding further adjustment. There was enough time for adaptation to become continuity. Modern systems have begun operating differently. Before one adjustment fully settles, another arrives. A new platform replaces the previous one. A new workflow replaces the last workflow. Expectations shift. Markets reorganize. Algorithms change. Communication habits evolve. Professional roles expand. Economic uncertainty reshapes long-term plans. Each individual adjustment may seem manageable. Most of them are. The difficulty emerges somewhere else. Adaptation no longer has a clear ending dot. Without noticing, people begin organizing themselves around readiness rather than continuity. They remain mentally prepared for the next update, the next disruption, the next transition, the next reorganization. Flexibility becomes increasingly valuable. Permanence quietly becomes less practical. Stability begins feeling temporary. Perhaps this is why so many adults describe life as exhausting, even when everything appears to be functioning. They are not simply working. They are continuously reorienting themselves to environments that refuse to remain still. And recalibration requires attention. The more attention is invested in preparing for what comes next, the less remains available for becoming fully present in what already exists. The question is no longer whether we can adapt. We clearly can. The question is, what happens when adaptation never receives permission to become ordinary life? Imagine walking across a bridge that continuously extends itself while you are crossing it. Every step feels reasonable. Every adjustment makes sense. Yet the opposite shore never seems to arrive. After a while, you stop thinking about where you are going. Your attention shifts entirely toward maintaining balance. Perhaps this is the quiet transformation modern systems produce. Adaptation gradually stops feeling like a temporary passage. It begins feeling like the place where life itself happens. Most people believe they spend their lives adapting to change. New jobs, new technologies, new responsibilities. But look more carefully, and something else begins to appear. We rarely adapt to change itself. We adapt to what the new environment expects from us. Every system quietly defines a version of competence. It tells you what it means to communicate well, to work well, to succeed, to stay relevant. Those expectations are rarely announced. They simply become normal until they change again. Think about how often this happens. A profession that once rewarded experience now rewards constant learning. A workplace that once valued reliability now values flexibility. Communication that once happened face-to-face now happens through notifications, video calls, and instant messages. None of these shifts are necessarily wrong. They are responses to a changing world. But each one quietly updates the expectations surrounding ordinary life. The result is subtle. You are not only learning new skills, you are repeatedly adjusting your behavior to match new definitions of what counts as capable, productive, or successful. Eventually, adaptation stops feeling like responding to specific events. It becomes an ongoing negotiation with expectations that continue moving even while you are trying to meet them. This creates a strange psychological effect. The target rarely stays still long enough for achievement to feel complete. By the time one version of yourself has finally become competent inside one set of expectations, another set has already begun replacing it. The finish line doesn't disappear. It simply keeps moving while you are still running toward it. Perhaps this is why so many people describe a persistent feeling of never quite catching up. Not because they are falling behind, but because the environment they are adapting to has already continued moving forward. Imagine trying to hit the center of a target that slowly slides across the wall every time your arrow comes close. You would probably become better and better at shooting, but you might gradually stop believing that reaching the center was ever the point. Eventually, aiming replaces arriving. Perhaps modern systems create a similar experience. They do not simply ask us to improve. They quietly redefine what improvement means often enough that completion becomes increasingly difficult to recognize. If the environment continually changes its expectations, adaptation eventually begins changing something deeper than behavior. It begins changing the structure of the self. For most of history, different roles existed, but they usually grew from the same underlying identity. A parent remained the same person at work. A neighbor remained the same person at home. A friend remained recognizably the same individual across different parts of life. The situations changed, but the continuity underneath them remained largely intact. Modern environments increasingly reward something different. Instead of expressing one stable identity across many situations, we learn to activate different versions of ourselves for different systems. One version answers emails, another joins meetings, another negotiates with clients, another spends time with family, while yet another quietly scrolls through endless information late at night. None of these versions are necessarily false. Every one of them may be genuine. The question is something else. How often do they still feel connected to one another? The more frequently context changes, the more often identity reorganizes itself to match it. Over time, adaptation becomes less about changing behavior and more about switching configurations. Not because anyone consciously decides to become fragmented, but because different environments quietly reward different parts of the same person. Eventually, something subtle begins happening. Instead of experiencing yourself as one continuous identity, moving through different situations, you begin experiencing yourself as a collection of compatible versions, each optimized for a particular context. Together, they function remarkably well. But they rarely remain active long enough to fully integrate into one uninterrupted sense of self. Perhaps this is why old photographs can feel so unfamiliar. The person in the image was not simply younger. They existed before life required so many simultaneous configurations. Size. Looking back, you are not only meeting an earlier version of yourself, you are meeting someone whose inner continuity had not yet been divided across so many contexts. Imagine a beautiful piece of stained glass. Every fragment has its own color, its own shape, its own purpose. From a distance, they create one image. But now imagine someone quietly separating those fragments and placing each one into a different window. None of the pieces disappear. None become less beautiful. Yet standing before any single window, you can no longer see the whole picture. Perhaps identity changes in a similar way. We do not necessarily lose ourselves. We distribute ourselves so widely across different contexts that the experience of being one continuous person becomes increasingly difficult to recover. One of the quietest assumptions we carry through life is that, despite everything changing, we remain part of one continuous story. We expect childhood to lead naturally into adulthood. We expect yesterday to remain connected to today. Even when life becomes difficult, we assume there is still a thread running through it all. Not because every chapter looks the same, but because they still feel like chapters of the same book. Continuity is what allows memory to become identity. It is not enough to remember what happened. Those memories must still feel as though they belong to the same person who is remembering them. When that connection remains intact, change feels like growth. The past becomes part of the present. The present naturally extends into the future. But what happens when continuity itself begins to weaken? Not because memories disappear, not because personality suddenly changes, but because every new period of life demands another adaptation before the previous one has fully settled. The result is subtle. Life begins feeling less like one unfolding story and more like a collection of disconnected chapters. One demanding project, one difficult season, one career transition, one technological shift, one financial adjustment, one family responsibility. Each chapter makes sense on its own, yet the invisible thread connecting them becomes increasingly difficult to feel. Nothing appears broken from the outside. You still remember the events, you still recognize the photographs, you still know that every version was you. And yet, something quietly resists that conclusion. The continuity between those versions no longer feels immediate. It has become something you understand intellectually rather than experience naturally. Perhaps this is why so many people describe an unexpected distance between themselves and their own past. They are not remembering someone else. They are remembering themselves without fully recognizing the uninterrupted journey that should connect both versions together. Maybe identity does not disappear all at once. Maybe continuity simply becomes too fragmented to be felt. Imagine watching a river from above. From a distance, it appears as one continuous flow. Now imagine placing walls across it every few hundred meters until the water collects into separate reservoirs. Every reservoir still contains the same water. Every section still belongs to the same river. Yet standing beside any one of them, it becomes increasingly difficult to experience the river as one uninterrupted movement. Perhaps our lives can quietly begin feeling the same way. Not because the water disappeared, but because the continuity that once allowed us to experience it as a single river has gradually been divided into isolated stretches. By now, a different picture begins to emerge. Perhaps the strange feeling of no longer recognizing yourself is not an isolated psychological experience. Perhaps it is the natural consequence of living inside an environment that continuously rewrites the conditions from which identity is formed. Identity requires continuity. Continuity depends on context remaining recognizable long enough for experience to accumulate into a stable sense of self. But modern systems rarely remain still. Technology evolves, markets reorganize, communication transforms, expectations shift, roles multiply, and before continuity has time to settle, another change arrives. Adaptation follows. Then another change arrives. Then another. Then another. None of these developments are inherently wrong. Many have improved human life in extraordinary ways. The question was never whether progress should stop. The question has always been whether human identity develops at the same speed as the environments it inhabits. Perhaps this is where the quiet misunderstanding begins. When people say, "I don't feel like myself anymore," they often assume something inside them must have broken. Something must have been lost. Something must have gone wrong. But perhaps nothing malfunctioned at all. Perhaps the system simply continued doing what highly adaptive systems naturally do. It kept optimizing. It kept updating. It kept increasing responsiveness. It kept creating new contexts faster than continuity could fully absorb them. And human identity responded exactly as living systems usually respond. It adapted, again and again, until adaptation itself quietly became the permanent condition of being alive. Until adaptation itself quietly became the permanent condition of being alive. Perhaps this is why the feeling described in Punchline Protocol has become so recognizable to so many adults. Not because modern people are weaker, not because they have less character, not because they have forgotten how to be themselves, but because becoming yourself increasingly requires something the surrounding environment rarely provides. Enough uninterrupted continuity to allow one version of you to fully become the foundation for the next. Without that continuity, identity does not disappear. It simply never receives enough stillness to finish becoming itself. Imagine reading a novel while someone quietly replaces one page every few chapters. The story still makes sense. Every page connects to the next. You continue reading without stopping. Yet somewhere, almost imperceptibly, the feeling of one uninterrupted narrative begins to weaken. Not because any single page was wrong, because continuity itself was gradually diluted. Perhaps this is what modern systems do to identity. They do not erase the story. They simply keep rewriting enough of the surrounding pages that, one day, the protagonist quietly wonders whether he has always been the same person. Perhaps the most important discovery isn't that you changed. People have always changed. Every generation has. Every life has. Change was never the mystery. The mystery is something quieter. For thousands of years, people changed inside worlds that usually remained recognizable long enough for those changes to become part of one continuous life. Today, something fundamental feels different. The world no longer waits long enough. Before one season becomes familiar, another begins. Before one routine settles, another replaces it. Before one version of yourself fully arrives, the conditions around it have already moved on. Perhaps this is why so many people open an old photograph and experience something they cannot quite explain. They recognize the face. They remember the day. They remember the people. Yet the person inside the photograph feels strangely distant. Not because memory failed, not because identity disappeared, but because continuity quietly dissolved between those moments. Perhaps nothing ever took that person away. Perhaps the world simply kept moving faster than continuity could keep introducing one version of you to the next. And perhaps the greatest misunderstanding of modern life is believing that identity is something you either have or lose. Maybe identity has always been something the environment slowly allows to grow. When the environment changes faster than that growth can happen, becoming unfamiliar to yourself is no longer a personal mystery. It becomes the expected result. The architect of this channel kept returning to one simple question. Why does an ordinary photograph sometimes feel like evidence from another lifetime? The answer may have had very little to do with the photograph itself. Perhaps photographs preserve something we rarely notice while living, not only where we were, not only who we were with, but the continuity that quietly connected one ordinary day to the next. And perhaps that continuity was never guaranteed. Perhaps it was something the surrounding world once protected more easily than it does now. If that is true, then the question is no longer, where did the person in the photograph go? The question becomes, what kind of world makes it increasingly difficult for one version of you to ever fully become the next? If today's conversation helped you understand why feeling unfamiliar to yourself may be less about personality and more about the conditions surrounding it, then you've just explored one layer of a much larger investigation. If you want to understand how these conditions are experienced from the inside, begin with Punchline Protocol, where human experience comes first. If you want to understand the systems that quietly shape that experience, this is where we continue asking those questions. And if you want to step back even further, connecting human experience with the systems that produce it, Debrief Protocol brings both perspectives together into one wider view. Protocol Multiverse isn't a collection of channels, it's one investigation viewed from different layers. Every path begins somewhere. The rest are waiting in the description. The links to every part of the investigation are waiting in the description. The ideas are human. The narration is digital. The interpretation is yours.